Welcome to Mission 150, the podcast that tells stories from 150 years of Seventh-day Adventist mission to the world. To find out more about the mission of the Adventist Church today, go to adventistmission.org. That's adventistmission.org.
Welcome back. We're so glad that you've chosen to join us again on another episode of Mission 150. I'm David Trim.
And I'm Sam Nevis. David, last episode we talked about bureaucracy and the importance of having a good, solid process for recruitment and training, deployment, and even returning home of missionaries. And we talked about the custodian of that bureaucracy to be the Secretariat department. We know we didn't use the term until the 1930s, Secretariat. It was the Secretary department, however they referred to it at the time. And
sometimes secretarial, or sometimes they talk about the secretary and his department.
I see. So the reason why we love historians is that you've read all of the General Conference minutes of those days, and we don't have to. We can just ask you questions, and you can help us understand the period. So we left off where Spicer in 1903 became the secretary. He loved mission, was focused on mission. In fact, all three officers, president, secretary, and treasurer,
exactly,
loved mission. And
yes,
turns out that had a profound impact in what the church does, because all three administrators were encouraging each other and holding each other accountable for sending missionaries and reaching different parts of the world.
Yes. So
then a process was refined, and we end up with, instead of if I remember correctly, 1897, we had 148 missionaries. And now we are sending more than 100 every year.
Yes. For the first 30 years of the 20th century, they averaged more than 100 every year. And in the 20s, they're sending 150 or more every year.
How did they refine the process of sending it and the whole bureaucracy behind it?
So it's a great question, Sam. From 1912, there was actually somebody called the missionary secretary on Spicer's staff. It was a man called Tyler Bowen, and we can share a photo of him and his wife Gertrude in the video version. In 1915, his job title was changed to office secretary. Now, today, that sounds a rather demeaning title. It sounds like an administrative assistant. But actually, in America in the early 1900s, office secretary had a grander meaning. It meant the person in charge of the staff of an office.
A bit like a chief of staff, but for the secretary.
Yes, so it's a significant administrative position. Now, by this time, by 1915, there was also an assistant secretary supporting the secretary, Spicer. And in 1918, they added a new officer, the associate secretary. And meanwhile, since 1904, there had been a statistical secretary. But in addition, there were a team of ordinary secretaries and clerks who did and stenographers, as they were called, people who took shorthand and then typed up letters and so on and so forth. Bowen oversaw that office staff, a position he actually held until 1941. So he's in charge of missionary processing for 30 years, so there's a considerable degree of continuity. What did it mean in practice to be in charge of the secretary's office? Well, we know because we have Bowen's papers surviving in the General Conference archives. His work was overwhelmingly to do with missionaries, and this highlights how much Secretariat is focused on mission. Because today, the head of all the staff in the Secretariat office would have quite a number of things to take care of, because the range of responsibilities has broadened, especially in the last 50 years. It's now very much concerned with governance and policy, which are important things, but do take away from mission. Whereas if you look at Bowen's work, here he is, he's first the missionary secretary, then he's the office secretary, he's in charge of the office, and overwhelmingly his time is spent on dealing with missionaries, making contact with newly assigned missionaries, getting all their documents, submitting applications for passports and visas from foreign governments, which of course is essential, then arranging for them to actually go overseas, and then corresponding with them once they were actually serving. This is the day-to-day of Bowen's work. So it tells us that the Secretariat really is overwhelmingly focused on mission and on missionaries.
This might be surprising to most even pastors, because at a local conference and union, I would say, the department or the office that is kind of the custodian for mission is the president. The president focuses on mission, and maybe the personal ministries department and evangelism usually is there. But the idea that the secretary would have its focus on reaching the parts of that territory that are not yet reached,
Right.
it's very much a GC thing that, as far as I can tell, in most places has not materialized to more local levels.
You're absolutely.
What have you noticed?
You're absolutely correct. But the reason for this, we have to go back to our episodes where we talked about the 1901 and 1903 reorganizations, because the GC has devolved an enormous amount of responsibility to the unions, which in turn have their conferences that they relate with. So in terms of administration, the General Conference, if you recall in those episodes, has quite deliberately said, we are going to delegate as much authority as we can so that we can focus on the mission. So there is a need for administration within the GC itself, and the Secretariat takes care of that. The Secretary's team takes minutes for the General Conference Executive Committee, for the General Conference sessions, and also for the meetings of the officers, which are regular and are important. But it's only the administration of the office itself which can be partly left to the departments, the youth, the missionary volunteers, the Sabbath school, the health and temperance, and so forth. They, to some extent, handle their own administration. So the secretary and his team can focus on these worldwide mission responsibilities. And starting in 1922, there were actually 2 associate secretaries. So they introduced an assistant secretary in 1915, an associate secretary in 1918, and a second associate secretary in 1922. And subsequently, the number was gradually increased until there were 6. So what they're doing is increasing the size of the Secretariat, and so it's being given more responsibilities.
To handle the complexities of more missionaries to more places.
Exactly, because if you're sending out more than 3,000 missionaries in 30 years, that means you're going to have more than 2,000 missionaries maybe in service at any one time. Certainly towards the end of the period, the people die and go home. But you're going to have a large number actually in service, and you have to support all of them. So what is it the associate secretaries do? They have a number of roles, including some for administration at the GC, but they were responsible for actually recruiting missionaries. And that's a very interesting process in its own right. How do you identify a future missionary? What the associate secretaries do is keep in close touch with colleges and hospitals in North America, and to some extent in Europe and Australasia. So the associate secretaries every year will visit between them, they will visit all the colleges and hospitals in the United States.
It's their recruitment pool.
It's their recruitment pool. Because you've got the students at the colleges, you've got doctors at hospitals, but you've also got nursing programs at hospitals. Back then, nursing programs were in hospitals rather than universities. And that's where so the students are at the colleges and the student nurses are at the hospital.
Some people ask me, why is it that the church has schools and hospitals? When I introduced the church brand to other organizations. And it just occurred to me for the first time, if God needed an army of missionaries to be sent in the 20th century, he had to provide a vision in the 19th century for them to start schools and hospitals, so we would have people that are prepared and motivated and focused on the missional aspect of their professions, so we can choose from them. Because you don't wake up one day and find 100 people deciding to go, who are ready to go, who have been resourced to go, who have been inspired to go. So our hospitals and schools, it seems to me, in this golden period of Adventist mission, are absolutely fundamental, because if you don't have them, where do you find new missionaries?
100%, Sam. And there are other reasons for having schools, colleges, and universities and hospitals. They're part of a bigger plan by God, but part of it is exactly this. And so by establishing these institutions, we have a place to turn to get a pool of recruits. And our colleges and hospitals themselves were very mission focused. By the 1920s, if not earlier, every Adventist college, including the ones in Europe and Australia, would have had what they called missionary bands. These were associations of students who were interested in mission and were saying, I want to go as a missionary myself once I've graduated. And so the missionary bands will have they'll have.
Are these like clubs?
Yeah, it's a club.
Okay.
It's a club or a society. They will bring in returned missionaries or furloughing missionaries to speak. When the General Conference Associate Secretary, who's assigned to that college or hospital, makes his visit, he will meet with them. And so you have these missionary bands. So the colleges themselves are basically set up telling people, yes, think about volunteering for mission service. It's not just a place where you do education. You know, it's a matter of some disgruntlement among some American Adventists that our American colleges no longer have the title missionary in them. They all used to Washington Missionary College, Southern Missionary College. Many of them had missionary in the title, and it got taken out because it no longer fits with secular ideas of what a university or a college is about.
Mm-hmm.
And
were we unique in this, or was that common among other Christian
there were others as well.
institutions?
There were others as well, but it was particularly prevalent amongst Adventists. And to me, there's no problem in changing the name, because you need to have colleges or universities whose graduates are credible and can find work.
But it does mean that leadership needs to be much more focused on it, so it doesn't happen that it will lose focus.
Exactly. It's one thing to take out the name, but you don't want to lose the ethos.
Yeah.
And our colleges and universities today are less focused on producing volunteers for mission than they were. There's no question of that. And so for anyone who's been to an Adventist university today, you have to think that going to an Adventist college in the 1910s or 1920s was a very different experience in all kinds of ways, of course, but not least in the focus that was being put on mission and mission work, and the way that the institution itself was saying to people, consider this as a future career.
I see this in some universities. I have not visited many universities in North America. I have visited some in Europe, in Africa, Asia, and South America. But my experience in South America, my last experience of this was in South America, where they brought the communication students to a sort of a inaugural lecture and so on. At the beginning of every semester, they call all of the classes together, graduate, undergraduate, etc. And these were the communication students. They have about 600 in the course that's studying various aspects of communication. Marketing is one of them. And at the end of it, I was surprised that the questions related to how can they work for the church? How can they be, part of what the church does? And at the end of the event, there were lines of people that wanted to talk to us about how they could, what's their first step to start working for some part of the world,
right,
in the area of communication. So there was a clear missionary spirit there in this university. What's your instinct about how we can revive that in other universities?
I think it needs to start with administration. I think the GC Education Department needs to gather all the university and college presidents together and pitch a vision to them, cast the vision before them and say, we need you to do this.
To prepare missionaries to go elsewhere, abroad somewhere.
Right. You need to be doing things in your institution that emphasize the importance of missionary service and that direct students' attention to the thought, I can do something for the church. I can do something bigger than myself.
Mm-hmm.
I can do something bigger than just getting a job that will pay me well. But that's important too, because without the tithe and offerings that come in from church members, none of this could happen. But there will always be a minority of students who want to go as missionaries or even are capable of that.
But that's always been the case.
That's always been the case, exactly. But then if you look at the numbers involved in Adventist tertiary education back in the early 20th century and compare it to the numbers going out as missionaries, would have been a formidably high figure, I would say.
And despite having more students now, and they had less students then,
Right.
they,
But our
they were
institutions today aren't focused. They don't see themselves as being partly an institution to prepare students to go as missionaries. But that was the case in these years, and so the associate secretaries are visiting. Each of them has a number of hospitals and colleges they're assigned to that they visit every year,
and they do their rounds.
and they do their rounds, and so they go to the mission, and so they meet people while they're there who say, yes, I'm interested in missionary service. So you put them on your list as potential candidates for the future, and there are other people who write to the GC Secretariat and volunteer for service. So what happens next? When a foreign field puts through a call, which is what it's known as in the Adventist Church, puts through a call for a missionary, it gets sent to the local division office, which then transmits it to the General Conference Secretariat, where an associate secretary would be assigned responsibility for filling the call, for finding somebody to respond to the call.
And it's a recruitment agency.
It is. No, that's right. It's today, as I say, it's governance and policy. Back then, and it still does some recruiting, but back then it was to a very great extent a recruiting agency for missions, and a morale and a sustaining agency as well, because the associate secretaries keep in touch with missionaries once they're in field. But so here you've got the call. You go through your list of likely persons and say, who can fill this? Sometimes they simply call for a pastor or for a church worker, which means in certain parts of the world you could end up doing
anything
and everything. But at other times they will be specific. We need a doctor, or we need a nurse, or we need a school teacher. So you've got to look at people who can they fill what's being requested.
And they did not have LinkedIn at this time.
They didn't have Vivid Faith. They had a card index and they had correspondence files.
Huh.
And once the associate secretary had found someone to fill the call, the rest of the secretariat office took over, managing everything relating to the logistics of the call until the missionary and his or her family were actually in the mission field, after which the associate secretary who had recruited them would be responsible for keeping in touch with them, arranging their furlough, helping them educate their children in boarding schools or colleges, and eventually, all being well, bringing them home permanently again. So that's how the system worked. You've got the general office staff who are very much focused on the processing of the call, the administration. And we have Tyler Bowen's notebooks where he has a column for every person, and have they got a US passport or a passport of their own nation? Yes or no? And then a space for working through that. Have they received permission from a foreign government to work in a mission field? Yes or no? And it goes on. So it really is. It is a bureaucratic process, as we talked about in the past episode. But again, without the bureaucracy, none of it happens.
Can you imagine the chaos of no, you don't have permission to work. Now you need to go back. That happens today even sometimes. Imagine back then without that
being put back on a ship
process.
And saying, clear off, you're not
another
welcome.
month back home.
Yes. So you've got the backroom staff who are taking care of all that bureaucracy. Meanwhile, you've got the associate secretaries who are responsible for the recruiting and the pastoral care through correspondence with missionaries. And the associate secretaries themselves will travel. And so at those times they will visit colleges and hospitals in Europe and Australasia. But also they do visit the mission field and they meet the missionaries they're responsible for, or other missionaries as well, and encourage them. Try and hear, what are the difficulties you're facing? Get the word from the ground up. Is there perhaps a particular problem in this mission field that the church needs to attend to? So you've got a very nice organization with the different parts all being taken care of.
In one dimension, David, how many Adventists do we have around the period that you were describing here? I think it's the 20s and 30s, right?
I couldn't say off the top of my head, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands, not a million.
So hundreds of thousands of
Maybe
Adventists.
In the early period, tens of thousands.
You have one missionary who is in this particular country serving. They feel alone because that's common. They feel at times that God is very silent.
Yes.
And you have those letters, and we see what they're feeling.
Yes. And we have that in the correspondence that the Secretariat receives from missionaries in the field.
Which is my point. The secretary, associate secretary responsible for them, they are representing the care of hundreds of thousands of Seventh-day Adventists. The missionary cannot experience what it's like. Are they loved? Are they honored? Are they encouraged? Are they? Do Adventists believe in them? That all comes through the relationship they have with one person, the associate secretary who is taking care of them.
Yes.
And who, if he is careless, and if the correspondence is cold and distant, and they feel like nobody cares, they will feel like hundreds of thousands of Adventists do not care. Or they will feel encouraged and cared for because of the love that is demonstrated through this church-appointed representative.
And if you read the correspondence that Secretariat has with missionaries, and Bowen himself as office secretary often receives letters from missionaries as well and will reply. But if you look at the letters that all of the people in Secretariat are sending, they are clearly going to some effort to help to keep up the missionaries' morale. But they're doing more than that, Sam. Because the Secretariat's role expands. Because it's now in charge of missions and missionaries, it acquires new responsibilities regarding mission. One of them is to do with data. The statistical secretary I mentioned, there had been a statistical secretary since 1904. His role had originally been simply to collect and publish statistics for every conference or mission, union, and division. But Harvey Edson Rogers, who was statistical secretary for 37 years, from 1904 to 1941, took on a wider analytical role. He didn't just print groups of numbers. Secretariat began to engage in what was effectively strategic planning for mission. Now, the term strategic planning hadn't been invented yet.
Right.
But Secretariat...
It wasn't available for him to...
Right. But what Secretariat did was start to plan strategically for mission expansion based on analysis of church statistics and wider statistics. And so you can see documents that are being prepared for discussion by the GC officers saying there are this many 100 million or tens of millions of people in this country. There are only this many Adventists, or perhaps there are none. And yet there are these communication links. This is a good target for sending missionaries to. And then once, as it develops, they'll say, we have this many tens of millions of people and these many Adventist missionaries and this many Adventist church members.
And this is the precursor, obviously, to your department, because part of what you do is provide that analysis.
The statistical secretary is the predecessor of the Office of Archive, Statistics and Research.
In fact, much of the predecessors to the whole Secretariat today, you can be traced back to this period, almost
Yes,
all of it.
All of it, I think. But here's the other thing, and I said that there was another role that this Secretariat had. Because in the 1920s and 1930s, Secretariat took over promotion for mission giving. So we've got the system that recruits, we've got the system that takes care of everything and gets them out there and brings them back. We've got the people who take care of them and express, as you very nicely put it, that love of hundreds of thousands of church members. You've got data analysis and planning, but now you add to that mission promotion. And because the Secretariat regularly received letters from missionaries all around the world, that was the place where you asked missionaries to write statements or articles or brochures that appealed for giving to missions. And this is where you get the mission stories that always accompany appeals for giving. You never just simply appeal for giving to missions. You always tell a story first, rather like we're doing in our podcast.
Yes.
And then we need to appeal for the giving to missions. So don't forget that. Don't forget to give to missions.
Make sure you give.
But that started with Secretariat because they were the ones who were receiving all this correspondence. So it's a natural step because they receive the correspondence, but also because they are now associated with mission. The Secretariat is the mission department. They start to do all the work of promoting for mission giving. And so associate secretaries will take letters from missionaries and turn them into articles for church papers. We know this because we can see the associate secretaries handwritten annotations that basically say, cut this, do this, and keep this, change this, and then he sends it to the Review and Herald, the church's paper, and they publish it as though it's an article. And it will be a story normally of something extraordinary or heroic to try and inspire church members.
It seems to me that what you see here is a desire for constant expansion.
Yes.
How can we
Yes.
send more missionaries? Well, we need a better process. Okay, let's refine the process. How can we send more missionaries? Well, we need better recruitment. So you go and fix that. Okay, now we have this whole thing. It's working well. What do we need? Well, we need more money.
Yes.
So let's encourage people to give more.
Right.
So it's this constant desire for development and improvement and expansion
Right.
of mission.
And so actually Tyler Bowen writes to one missionary and says, we've just finished preparation for ingathering, but actually there is a year-round cycle of work for us because we've no longer finished with one fundraising drive, then we're beginning work for the next.
And notice the terminology, fundraising drive.
Well,
we need
that's my terminology, but that's what...
rather than theirs.
Yes, but he's saying this is what we do year-round because there are these different mission offerings. We talked about this last episode. It's not just 13th Sabbath offering. There's also the week of sacrifice offering, which is taken very seriously. There's the big week. There's the midsummer offering. All of these things, and there's ingathering where they appeal to the general community to support what they're doing. So they are doing this work all year round. They're either preparing materials or publishing materials for one of these mission offerings.
To what degree did the urgency of the second coming play a part in the giving and the fervor of sending people to other parts of the world?
There's no question that that's what drives it, Sam. You can read the articles written by missionaries or by the team in the Secretariat. Christ is coming again soon, and we have to save as many people as we can before he comes back. We need as many people as possible to hear this saving message before Christ comes back again. And also the awareness, though, that people like Daniels and Spicer often emphasize when they speak. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end shall come. And Daniel's actually at one point says then, and not until then. And so this is a text that Daniels and Spicer often use. So it's not only that we have to save as many people as possible before Christ comes, or at least share the message with them. Christ, of course, God decides who will be saved. But we need to share the message with as many people as possible before Christ comes, but also an awareness Christ isn't going to come unless we share the good news more widely.
There has been over the last many years an attempt in some Adventist theological circles to diminish that message as non-biblical, so as to say, isn't it a bit arrogant for you to think that the Adventists are going to be responsible for and will fulfill this mission that was given, this work that needs to be done before Jesus can come? God will do what God will do despite of what you do. So don't think for a moment that your efforts are actually having an impact in the future of the world and what God does. If that rhetoric was brought to this part of Adventism, it seems to me it would be utterly rejected immediately.
There would be they wouldn't waste 2 seconds on it, Sam. They wouldn't waste 2 seconds on it.
To the degree that this is accepted, it is the end of Adventist mission as we know it, if I can put it this way, because there is this sense of urgency that we have a work that God entrusted to us. And we need to do it diligently to the best of our ability, using every talent and resource that God has given us. Of course, God will do what God will do.
Yes.
We don't determine God's timing. It is His timing. But He is the one that said that this proclamation will happen.
Right. And some people are
to every language.
And some people are concerned about, clearly God is going to save some people who've never heard the message. Or he's dooming all kinds of people to an eternal fate.
So why the effort? He's going to save who he's going to save.
Right. And God will save whom he wants to save. I can say, speaking personally, I am glad that God is the judge, because the one thing I know about the judgment is that it says, judge not lest you be judged.
With the same measure you judge.
With the same judgment you use, it will be used against you. Yeah. That's actually perhaps the most terrifying text in the Bible.
Yeah. I remind my children constantly of this as they try to talk about each other.
And God will work things out according to his omniscience and his love. But God gave us a command, and the command was go and preach to all the nations, and also that until it's preached to all the nations, the second coming is not going to happen. Christ is not going to come again until that happens. And so I think, for me, Sam, let's leave aside the question of eternal judgment. I think it's better for people to be a Seventh-day Adventist in the here and now.
Sure.
Especially in parts of the world where health and hygiene and so forth are little understood. You immediately have a dramatic expansion of the life expectancy in Adventists because they give up smoking, they give up alcohol.
Yeah. And not just elsewhere, even in the United States, Adventists live longer demonstrably.
Right. Adventists have around 67% of the mortality rate of the general population, which reflects the Adventist health advantage. So it's not just that Adventists, we know about blue zones and Adventists living to 100 more than other people, but also you see it in the death rate figures. So I believe that to be an Adventist in the here and now is
advantageous too.
Is advantageous, and it's a blessing. And you're living more like we have a message that tells people you can live more like God wants you to live, and it will be a blessing to you as well as being pleasing to Him.
And you anticipate what life will be in the new earth as much as possible in the old one.
Yes.
And when one of these Adventists says, I will go because I want the people of this particular country or place in the world who don't know anything about Jesus to know that He's coming, what they're doing isn't deciding their fate. What they're doing is increasing the chances for them to make it, to live eternally.
Yes.
So there is a better chance that the people of that city will live forever because somebody from this city said, I will go, send me, I'm going to be a missionary who's going to do that. So God will do what God will do, but there are increased chances, and that's the best we can hope for.
Right. And it's because somebody's from this city said, I'll go over there, but it's also because somebody in the General Conference Secretariat, or several people, did the work necessary for them to be sent. So in the first 20 to 25 years of the 20th century, Secretariat became mission central. And the inspiring thing is that an effective bureaucracy powered mission growth around the globe. So bureaucracy isn't what we want to talk about when we talk about mission. We want to talk about heroic self-sacrifice and miraculous interventions and those stories of people on the cutting edge. But without the effective bureaucracy, none of that happens.
And God has given a particular group of people special gifts and talents to do the bureaucracy. There are people that the world presents itself to them as an orderly place or a place in need of order. And they want to organize it. They want to create processes for it. Others have this heart for other missionaries.
Yes.
And will provide incredible pastoral care to enable mission. It isn't the case that we all should be doing the same thing.
Exactly.
God gave some gifts to people that are statistically driven. The truth is, the world presents itself to you, David, differently than other people. And you have the ability to see patterns in data that other people may not. Some people in your team have incredible ability to see patterns in data that will inform mission and expand the impact of this message in different parts of the world. And God needs all of us to do our best with the gifts and talents that He's given us. And if we all participate in this way, then the Holy Spirit can use us in incredible ways to finish this mission and therefore fulfill the goal that God has set for us.
Yes. No, I believe that's true. Thanks so much for joining us in this episode of Mission 150. Please keep watching on AdventistReview.tv, on the Seventh-day Adventist Church's YouTube channel, or keep listening on your favorite podcast platform. If you have enjoyed this episode, please share about it with your friends. And if you want to know more about Adventist missionary work and missionaries today, go to AdventistMission.org. That's AdventistMission.org, where you can find opportunities to give and to pray. If you want to find mission opportunities yourself today, opportunities for service, go to vividfaith.com. We'll be back next week with more on the inspiring history of Adventist mission
around the world.